So this is a code amendment the Planning and Zoning Commission has been working on for the last couple months. Deals with nonconformities, typically within zoning codes of communities across the United States. You have to deal with nonconformities, which are uses, lots, or structures that were permitted underneath a previous zoning code, but you had subsequent zoning code changes, and now they're restricted, regulated, or not allowed for some reason. And what you typically see within Moscow, the common occurrence, the problems we run into are nonconforming structures. So you have structures that maybe don't meet the setback requirements underneath the current zoning code, or maybe don't meet height requirements underneath the current zoning code. You also have nonconforming uses of structures, which deals with, common example would be a duplex within a single-family zone. And so up until this point, up until about 2008, we really didn't have any issues with these. As you know, the Great Recession, banks started to watch a little bit more closely when they're lending on properties, and we really started to run into issues with that duplex within single-family zones, that if ever gets destroyed, it can't be rebuilt. And so that's really created some issues with people. Brought this to the attention of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and we had researched a few other municipalities within the region. So we had taken a look at Boise, Sandpoint, Pullman, and Spokane. Really identified that our current regulations were overly restrictive compared to some of these other jurisdictions, and brought this to the attention of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and the Commission decided to take a look at it and to move forward with a code amendment. So looking at the nonconformity section of the zoning code, we go through kind of an intent statement as to why we regulate them, what nonconformities are. We have some nonconforming lots of record section, which we haven't had any issues with up to this point. Essentially, even if your lot doesn't meet the minimum lot width or lot size, you're still eligible for at least a single-family dwelling. We've got nonconforming uses of land. We ran into this a little bit with agricultural uses that were still within the city, maybe got annexed at one point in time, and now, based upon the current zoning, had some issues with those. But as you recall, 2013, we had the Urban Agricultural Ordinance, which legitimized a lot of agricultural activities that were currently happening within the city and allowed more. So we don't run into any issues with that anymore. Like I mentioned before, it's really the nonconforming structures, nonconforming uses of structures section that we run into problems with. And then there's a repairs and maintenance category at the end, which talks about what you can and can't do to some of those structures or uses currently permitted. So looking a little bit closer at the proposed changes in the nonconforming structures section, really restrictive right now. We restrict whether those structures can be enlarged, altered in any manner. We want those to decrease their nonconformity but not increase the nonconformity. Major changes that we're proposing are going to be a possibility of a conditional use permit, which would allow for an addition onto a nonconforming structure. Say it didn't meet the rear yard setback requirement. Right now they're able to expand onto that structure, but the new addition to that structure has to meet current setback regulations. Planning and Zoning Commission wanted a route to provide the public in order to go through a conditional use permit, which is a public hearing before the Board of Adjustment in order to review those and to possibly allow an expansion of those structures with the current nonconforming setback. And so subsection 1, that's why you see the insertion of the Moscow City Code portion, and that would point you down there to the bottom. Subsection 4, that a nonconforming structure may be enlarged or altered with the same zoning nonconformities through the issuance of the conditional use permit. The other major change for this section is the part that deals with whether or not you can reconstruct a nonconforming structure if it's ever burnt down or destroyed. Right now you can't. If it's destroyed to 70% of the replacement cost, you're required to construct a new structure that meets all current requirements. What we would be inserting here would be that if it was destroyed at no fault of the owner, so it would be a fire, flood, natural disaster, etc., that you'd be able to reconstruct that having the same zoning nonconformities as long as there's no more than existed when it occurred. So those are the major changes in the nonconforming structures section. And then at the very end, repairs and maintenance. Right now it's really specific as to what you can't do, and then you have this redundant language that would seem to say that you can't do an addition onto a structure if the volume of the structure that existed before it became non-conforming shall be increased. So you really, that's really in conflict with that non-conforming structure section. So we're eliminating that language and then just really generalizing the statement instead of being real specific as far as repair, replacement of non-bearing walls, fixtures, wiring, plumbing. It's just ordinary maintenance. You run into issues with any type of structure that may be 100 years old and you're doing repairs to it. Oftentimes you're going to have a portion of the foundation that's going to need to be rebuilt, and that would certainly qualify as some type of a bearing wall. So proposing to really generalize that language. And then the non-conforming uses and structures in combination, your common duplex within a single-family zone. Right now, if it's ever destroyed, it can't be rebuilt except as whatever's permitted in that zone. So if the duplex got destroyed, it could be rebuilt as a single family, but you wouldn't be entitled to that duplex. And so this is where the rub comes in with the lending institutions not wanting to lend on something that they can't recoup their investment. And so what the commission had come up with to alleviate that issue within the community would be to allow the construction should the structure be damaged, destroyed by no fault of the owner, so that fire, flood, natural disaster. But it's restricted to the original size and use prior to destruction. So it could be that duplex is destroyed. They won't be able to double the size when they rebuild. It would be limited to what the current size is of that duplex. And that's really the only change other than to eliminate subsection 5 underneath this. Since we're allowing the reconstruction of those non-conforming uses of structures, we don't need any type of definition of what constitutes a destruction, which is 70% of the replacement cost of the whole structure. So we had just eliminated that. Planning and Zoning Commission did conduct a public hearing. That happened October 26th of this year, and they recommended approval of the ordinance to City Council. And staff's recommendation tonight is to conduct a public hearing and, upon consideration of testimony presented, approve the ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary. And I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay. Questions for Mike before we open this up for public hearing? Walter?
Thank you, Mayor. Mike, do you have any idea how many structures are out there that this change would impact?
I don't. We have some problem areas of town, Kenneth, Harold area. We've got a kind of northeast area, Highland Drive. There's, areas that it's primarily duplexes that were allowed at one point all over the city. And so you have these intermingled. It's usually the older neighborhoods.
Quite a few?
Yeah, quite a few, yeah. I couldn't throw a number out there, but I'd probably say, maybe over at least 20, 30,
if I may.
Maybe more than that.
Mm-hmm. I understand why you're wanting to change it and why the P&Z agreed to change it. I don't fully understand why it was written the way it is now originally. Can you hazard a guess? Can you?
Well, these were
read somebody's mind from decades ago?
This is probably one of those portions of the zoning code that's been there ever since the beginning, so we probably 40, 50 years. And it never really became an issue until 2008. We never got calls in our office previously about whether or not you could rebuild a structure. And now that's a pretty common call we get from appraisers and lending institutions. So, the original intent was to have these non-conforming structures and uses lost by time. So you do a zone change. You want to, eventually throughout time eliminate the nonconformities. And, 120 years, the typical home life, you're going to run into issues with the lending institutions just based upon the number of dwellings that we have out there that the zones changed on them at one point in time. So
one last one, if I may.
Go ahead.
And finally, this applies to where the zoning has changed to the property owner, not where the property owner has done something that was not allowed within the zoning, but managed to create it anyway?
Correct. Yeah, it would be all legal nonconforming uses. So in the case of maybe going in under the radar and converting a single family to a duplex, we research all these nonconforming structures and uses and make sure that at one point in time they were allowed to be constructed and verify that information. So
And this would not apply in that circumstance?
it would not apply to
The change.
Yeah, we'd have it wouldn't. I mean, it would just apply to the legal ones. It wouldn't apply to the, possibly some illegal ones that we may have out there.
Okay, thank you, Mayor.
John, did you have a question?
I just want to have you re-clarify, if you would, that the reason we're doing this, more than anything else, is to allow people that have made an investment to maybe recover that investment through the sale, and they were not allowed to do so because the banks had changed their rules and would not loan on pieces of property that they didn't feel, like you said, they could recover their loan on. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. I mean, it's more of an equity issue. At one point in time, the city allowed these to be constructed, has since, for whatever reason, changed the zoning of the area. Now it's non-conforming, and, it wouldn't be allowed to be rebuilt should it be destroyed, and so that's the big kicker. And what this would be changing would be that if it was destroyed at no fault of the owner, it would be allowed to be rebuilt, and it would alleviate the bank's concerns as far as lending on that property. Oftentimes what we run into is devaluation of property, as well as sitting on the market a lot longer, because usually you have to have a cash buyer that comes in to purchase the property if you can't get a loan through anybody. And so you're waiting longer for that cash offer to come in, and then it's usually devalued by thousands of dollars just because they have the buyer has leverage on you if you want to sell the property. So that's what this would be alleviating.
Thank you.
Other questions from Mike before I open the public hearing? Okay, I'll go ahead and open the public hearing at 7:52, and I will take testimony in favor, and as with all public hearings, I limit comments to 3 minutes. Okay, seeing nobody rush to the podium, I will take general testimony or opposition to this. Well, that made it easy. We'll close the public hearing at 7:53 and turn it over to council. Jim?
At this point, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to move that we approve the ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary.
Second.
Okay, we got a motion by Jim and a second by John to approve this ordinance under the suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and it be read by title and published by summary. I will take the roll, starting with Walter.
Aye.
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 Okay, so that has passed. Mike, thank you. And we have ordinance number 2016-14. Okay, ordinance number 2016-14. An ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 4, Chapter 1, relating to nonconforming structures and uses, providing that provisions of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approval, and publication according to law.